Thank you very much for coming. We've got a lot of photos going on. Hi. Do you feel like a bit of an imposter? In fact, when we were standing over there, Alan determinedly said, "What are you doing here?" I did confirm that I wasn't a Tolkien artist. Yet.
What is the name for and what's the noun for a collection of Tolkien illustrators?
What was the collective noun for a group of Tolkien illustrators?
An exhibition.
I don't think we need lengthy introductions of our panellists today. On my far right, I have Alan Lee. On my near right, Anke Eißmann. On my near left, Dolfen. Next to Jenny, we have Ted Nasmith. And on the far left is Johnstone. So I thought I'd start with a nice, easy icebreaker question. Alan, who's your favourite Tolkien artist?
Not including anyone who's on the panel.
You can be as diplomatic as you like. Ted, I'll come to you next. Just
Now's your chance to hide, Ted. Join.
That's a really difficult question, but I think probably the diplomatic answer has to be J.R.R. Tolkien.
So it looks like there's unanimity on the panel that they will all give that answer.
It's quite sure.
I guess the kind of, I'll start with you, Jenny, is why Tolkien? Why illustrate Tolkien? You know, the fact that we have got Tolkien as an illustrator himself, why bother?
I think it has to do, and I'm sure that this goes for all of us sitting here, that Tolkien just speaks to the creativity in an artist, and there is so much to be explored in his world, and there is so much that his writing just calls up in our minds that we want to bring again onto paper. And for me at least, I have to say that it is the tiny little things in between that are not said, but these questions of how did they go from here to there, and what happened in between, and what must have happened in between, which just fascinates me very much.
Okay. What do you think, Jay?
Sorry, I missed the question.
Why Tolkien? Why illustrate Tolkien?
I can only speak from a personal perspective. I know he's influenced so many people throughout the world. For me, he just haunts my dreams. His stories I find so relevant for my life, and he's been a great guide for me, both personally and in the art. I love to try and get under the skin of it a little bit more and try and understand the hidden. I think there's a lot of hidden meanings within Tolkien stories that I'm desperate to find out about. And for me, they occur through dreaming, and that inspires my imagination, and therefore the arts come out.
Excuse me, just speak up a little bit.
Sorry.
Just hold the mic.
So just personally for me, it runs in my blood. I just can't stop. It's like being haunted or possessed by his world, and I just really enjoy doing it.
Okay, so Jay is possessed. Do you think, Anke, do you think what Jay said is right? Do you think Tolkien is unique in that? Are there other authors that bring out those emotions, those feelings, those thoughts in the same way?
I do think, yes, because I know from personal experience that there are other things that might inspire you, but I think with Tolkien, his world is so large, and so there's so much detail, so many small things to pick out, or large epic things to consider, that you just stick with it. So it's not just a brief thing where you might be inspired for a month or two, but once you get into it, it just bound for life. It just doesn't let you go anymore.
You're haunted as well, are you? Or?
Yeah.
And do you think it is that epicism of Tolkien, that is the thing?
Yes, on one hand but on the other hand, as Jay said, it's very personal. Everybody finds something in it that maybe it's also because, or it depends on what time or stage in your life you encounter Tolkien, and that may change, and you come back to it because something in your life changes, and you do find something that corresponds with that, and you find solace or inspiration, or so it's a kind of escapism, but that's what escapism is supposed to be. It's supposed to give you strength. And I've heard so many great stories. People have come to me and told me what Tolkien means to them, what the various depictions of his work mean to them, and how it helped them through dark periods in their life and so on. And yeah, it creates community, and it really enriches your life.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Right, I think we're done then. So, Ted, Anke mentioned about sort of the epic imagery of Tolkien. You're obviously probably most known to us for your epic landscapes of Tolkien's world. What sort of drew you to Tolkien?
Well, I suppose a grey wizard arrived one day, knocked on my door and said, "We need an artist." But actually, when I started, I was about 14. The books grabbed me, and it's a great age to read them. It was very much a saving grace for me, a huge inspiration. And as an art student at the time, it took me in a whole other tangent into drawing fairies and wizards, elves, and so on, and hobbits. And then I soon found that the landscapes themselves were something that would be just wonderful to explore. And it seemed as though this book, which there weren't many illustrators around doing, wanted someone to give it a great deal more weight and seriousness. And I felt that that was what I was going to assign myself to do. I thought this needs a professional touch to it, and no one else seemed to be appearing to do so, and I just went on with it. It was a bit like Lewis and Tolkien saying, we must write the stories that we want to read. Well, I started painting the pictures that I wanted to see. I wasn't seeing anyone else doing those, and it just seemed to continue to renew itself. I established connection with so many fans who kept telling me, "How did you know what I saw in my mind's eye?" Which kind of puts the lie to the idea that everyone has an individual. There may be nuances and differences in how they interpret, but a lot of people seem to agree in many ways about what Tolkien, how it would look for them. And I just followed my own instincts on that, and it seems to have resonated, and it continues to renew itself, thankfully.
And do you ever worry that what you're doing are the conflicts of what Tolkien would have wanted, or even conflicts with Tolkien's own art? Does that ever worry you?
Oh yes. I mean, I take it very seriously as a kind of as if he himself had said, I need someone to take my work seriously and give it the kind of consideration and depth that it ought to get, that it deserves, and to strive for as authentic, a synthesis between the artist and the author. And that's an illustrator's job, so that's fairly obvious and basic as far as I was concerned. Just how do you carry that out? One picture may not be as successful as another, but over time it seems to be, it does seem to be enough success, and therefore you continue to do so.
Okay, and Jay, your artwork is a little bit different from others, I think it's fair to say. A refreshing change, I think, in many respects, to see a wide variety of Tolkien artwork. Do you worry about what Tolkien might have thought about your art?
I've been quite criticised for being, what's the word, sacrilegious, or not cooperative. But when I very first started my painting, they were very religious because they were based on dreams where I'd seen these images as religious images. When I started to paint, I actually thought they were crap. I didn't think they were very good at all. But when I exhibited first at Loughborough, I made a connection with certain people where they've never seen these sorts of movies before, and I made the connection between medieval and Tolkien, and included within that the Christianity. So were they sacrilegious? I don't know, and I let other people have that argument because it was beyond me to answer. I'm not an academic. I'm fairly uneducated. I think I've got 1 O level, and I've got a B in art, so I'm actually not that good. But I was quite lucky enough to touch some people, and there was a very early painting I did, is a Jewish being, which led to a whole concept about what was some of the underlying reasons behind Tolkien's work and some of the secrets that I found. And after presenting those concepts on stage in front of audiences who were quite academic, I did see the irony of it, but to have an academic then come up to you afterwards and say, that's really interesting, you should write a white paper on that, was a guy called Thomas Honegger. He says it's actually very meaningful, there's some deep reasons behind what you're doing that's beyond just the skin. It's not just about the paint, it's about the theories and the ideology and the theology behind the paintings. And I'm not religious, but my family is all Catholic, and my wife's Catholic, my children are all Catholics. And he took my ideas, which I thought, he's right, they're just thought processes of the creation of art. They're just the way I paint is almost like a thought process rather than an execution. And it ended up with him then reinforcing all these things that I'd said with quotes from Tolkien and from Tolkien's works. And I start to realise, actually, I'm not making this up. I'm not faking it. There are other people who agree with my paintings. There's other people who can't stand me, which is absolutely fine. I think with all artists, there are people you get it, but you don't get it. And I'm past the point of caring whether you don't get it anymore, because it's too personal to me and it's a religion to me. So to keep doing it and to keep exploring with it, I'm quite happy to do it. And for those of you who know me and buy my art, I am eternally grateful, because what else? I'm a designer by trade, and I do advertising. And to actually have people who will actually spend their hard-earned money on some paint that I've stuck onto a canvas, I find absolutely astounding. But it happens again and again and again. And Jenny, Anke and I, we're so thrilled with the guys who've been before, because these guys are giants. Well, I was reading these guys, looking at these pictures when I was first 18, looking at. So we carry on the art and the form of it. But these are the giants. These are the guys who made it, and particularly my love of Pauline Diana Baines. She was the girl who lit the fire. She's the one who started off, and she's the one that, Pauline Baines. So, and she's the one we're building on. To me, it is life. It is part of my life, and I'm eternally grateful for Tolkien and the likes of Pauline and these guys who helped build the fandom along with Tolkien. So thank you all for buying my prints, and I'm sure Anke and Jenny are exactly the same. We really do appreciate the fact you like us. Thank you.
So, Jenny, Jay talked there about kind of responding to criticism. So remember, I've known you for quite a few years now. I remember you faced quite a bit of criticism online, didn't you, at first? When some of your artwork first started appearing online, some people were quite critical of some of it.
Mostly of hair colour.
How do you respond to those sorts of things?
I'm not getting a lot of criticism in the way of keep your hands off that. Not really. What I get mostly is nitpicking, but maybe they're just not telling that to my face, but that's possible. But I think at the beginning, when my style was a bit more influenced by manga, I suppose, I was consciously trying to move away from that because I never want it. And there is a bit of comic in my style, which I'm perfectly fine with. And most people who like it tell me that this is why they come to my pieces. And I never really try to get away from that. So I'm very happy with where I am right now. And I'm pretty sure that there's a couple of rungs to the ladder yet that I can still climb. But I'm not really getting that much criticism, unless it is Fingolfin is blonde. Exclamation mark, 111.
Which of course he is, and we all know he's bald. Quite a few of you have mentioned about the fans. I guess with you, Alan, when you're doing your artwork, do you consciously think about how the fans will be responding to this?
Not too consciously. To a certain extent, if you that way lies madness.
Yes.
Try to imagine how everyone is going to react to it. Certainly, to a certain extent, you have to kind of rely on your own intuition and just kind of hope and trust that there'll be enough people out there who see things in a similar way.
Do you find fans motivating?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, getting good feedback is obviously a wonderful kind of spur to keep going.
And that helps you keep going with it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And do you think the Tolkien community is different from others in terms of its level of appreciation for artwork? Because I'm always surprised at Tolkien events just how much we talk about the art, how much we appreciate the art, how much we include the artists at events like this. Do you think other fandoms are the same?
To be honest, I don't know much about other fandoms. I've been to a few kind of science fiction, fantasy conventions, but I've never been to a Star Trek convention or Harry Potter or anything to do with Game of Thrones. So I'm not quite sure what they're like. I would imagine it's kind of similar, but probably with less kind of depth of passion, less scholarly.
You're sort of nodding to that, Anke.
Yeah, I know from other fandoms that there is...
This Sherlock?
For example, Sherlock. There is quite a lot of fan art, but of course there, as you do with the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit films, but Sherlock is basically a television series. You have the Sherlock Holmes stories, but the art is very much based on photographs and images from the series. And I think with Tolkien, because the canon is a text, there's a broader range of art that is being produced. But what I know from fandoms is that art always plays a very big part, because people, it is a way of expressing oneself, speaking as an artist, and maybe expressing things you can't put into words. And that was one of the reasons I started doing Tolkien art, because it affected me so much, and I found so much I liked in it. At the time I read it, I was 14-ish, 15, and I was very much into horses, as many people that age are. And, well, Lord of the Rings had got his horses in it, and I remember the very first drawing I did was one with the hobbits and their ponies in the old forest. So I found something I liked, like nature and horses, and it was very personal, and I moved on from there. And I think that's something many fandoms have in common, that art and fan art is something to pick up things you like and you want to communicate to others, maybe not non-verbally. And also, especially with fan art in other fandoms, to depict things that maybe are not in the show but should be there, because again they touch you personally, be it more diversity or representation and stuff like that.
Okay, and you talked about, you mentioned Sherlock there, and how lots of the art is born from the TV series, obviously. Now, in the last few years since the Lord of the Rings films, we've seen a lot of art that is based on the films. How do you guys respond to that? How do you feel about that? I might have sent Alan from this question, perhaps. So Jay had a little chuckle there. What do you think, Jay?
Ted's really good at answering this question.
Ted?
Pretty much ignored, I honestly. If it's a young person and they're showing me this thing, and they're very proud and it's very well done, I'm just happy to praise them for the effort and for them being inspired enough to do so. That's always a good thing. I won't comment or use judgment or say that you really should be making up your own and all that sort of thing. I just feel it's good that it inspires creativity ultimately, but I don't care for the art particularly.
Because you look at a lot of fan art online, and you'll just see those. Ian McKellen as Gandalf, as great as it was, that image just repeats over and over again, and Gollum and Frodo. Does that bother you?
Particularly, I mean, it's expected that would happen. I mean, it's a huge, for many people, that's their first introduction to the Lord of the Rings, so they're getting a massive sort of input suddenly, and if they're artistically inclined, as I was, I'm not surprised that it sends them off on this wonderful experience of their own to explore, you know. Yeah.
Okay. Sort of thinking about Tolkien, you were all very nice about Tolkien earlier, and how he's inspired you and created these images in your mind. And I want genuine answers to this question, which is, how does Tolkien frustrate you when you're trying to illustrate his artwork? And it can't just be a nice frustration like, oh, you didn't write enough, right? It's got to be a genuine, it's got to be a genuine answer. Jenny, you're looking at me.
Well, how does Tolkien frustrate me? Sometimes he does by making me really wonder, would he agree with what I'm doing? Which is something that has been echoed, and that was very interesting to hear in the talk on Tolkien reacting to artwork of his works in his lifetime. I think that most of us have this little head going in the back of this is voice going in the back of their heads when they're creating art based on Tolkien. Is that okay if I do this? If it's not okay, I will not do this. So it is definitely something that I get a lot, and I have to admit, when I first read the letters, I was horrified with how bad, with what bad things he had to say about much of the art. I was much younger then. I was guilty of a lot that he was probably criticizing, and I'm pretty sure that influenced me. And I really took a step back and said, no, I'm not doing that anymore.
What about you, Jane? What annoys you about Tolkien?
Annoys me is I think he's hidden too many things in the books. I really do think there are secrets within the books that we discover, and as I mentioned before, I discovered some by accident. And then an academic level, when I asked Thomas, I said, well, why don't you get this? You read the bloody books all the time. And he was like, well, he says, but you're coming from a different perspective. You're trying to create a painting and reasoning whether this painting should come into existence or not. And he says, we tackle it from the literal, from looking for the words and the clues between the references. So it's that I find frustrating. It's a nice sort of frustration, because it's a bit like looking for gold. It's a bit like looking for secrets within Tolkien's works that I quite enjoy, but I do find it frustrating because they're very hard to find.
And what about you, Ted?
There's probably a bit of a list there.
I'm looking forward to it.
I was asked this a couple of times this week already. There are definitely things that, to me, conflict with the purposes of art and presentation that limit things. And, you know, you have to either take liberties or be content with something that is somewhat constrained in terms of the expression and content of it. Facial features are not particularly described, and you know, elves without any beards or anything that's much that would distinguish them from each other. They don't seem to age particularly and have like, warts and other stuff like that. So there's a limit to the kind of creativity you can apply to that sort of thing. That's a problem to some extent. And then his geography occasionally is rather odd. One example being the rainbow cleft in Beleriand. Tour emerges from the underground river, and there's this thing going dead straight as if it was carved with a sort of great machine. It seems to be unnatural, not necessarily very real. Therefore, it leaves you with the choice of, well, do I do something that's actually a little more interesting for the eye and for the viewer as a result? And your black writers are coming across the the river. They're described as being envisioned as by Frodo without their cloaks. You can see beyond that and what they really look like. Well, which do you do? Them as with their cloaks on, as if it was someone standing there, or do you do it from Frodo's point of view? I guess both things are possible, and I have actually done both things. But it's, you know, there are things that present conundrums and choices and so on that you know, you just deal with, and you know, maybe do one way and one time, change it to another way another time, and see if you know people are kind of okay with that. It's yeah, I could probably write a bit of a thing on this also.
So Ted doesn't like how Tolkien described everything. What bothers you, Anke?
Yeah, but it's the same. Sometimes a bit more description would have been nice, and sometimes...
That's a nice answer.
Yeah, and sometimes just had he made up his mind a bit earlier, and we would not have 3 versions of the same story that contradict each other, would have been helpful.
You seem to agree with that, Alan. You had a little chuckle there.
Sometimes you get a picture in your mind of a particular character, just from a kind of a brief reading of the story, and then you go back to check on any sort of hints or descriptive details. And sometimes the heart sinks a bit and you think, oh, another blonde.
Or not.
Yeah, you kind of have a picture of somebody with, dark hair and a beard, and then you find out it's wonderful, kind of flaming silver or gold.
Who are you thinking of? Which character is this that you imagine with dark hair and a beard was actually...
I think it was... Was it Shaun? I think it was actually meant to be kind of blonde haired. I think so, yeah. And I just couldn't help but see him as sort of dark haired and quite kind of dark featured.
And when illustrating Tolkien and thinking about the characters, is that one of your main challenges? Is just because you mentioned hair colour as well, you mentioned about warts. Is that your main challenge? Is just thinking about actually what are the characteristics of them? Is this something you really learn later?
Well, on the books that I've done that have been, the Children of Thorin and the Great Tales books, where I've had quite a kind of close connection with Christopher Tolkien over the process of kind of designing the roughs for the drawing, for the images, and then getting his approval. So there's that kind of additional little edge that you have to kind of consider. And so I do pay more attention to the descriptions than I might otherwise do in any other kind of fiction. I mean, the main thing for me is not to kind of jar with the image of the reader, being encouraged to produce in his own mind through the text.
Does that apply to characters as well as locations and landscapes?
I suppose the characters are kind of more problematic. The landscapes you can be a little bit free with. I mean, I think Tolkien's descriptions of landscapes are very evocative, but he doesn't kind of place every rock, every cliff. It just gives you kind of a feeling of that place. So you've actually got a lot of freedom to create beautiful landscape paintings within.
Unless it's El's hair colour, in which case not so much freedom. So I guess when I was thinking about this panel earlier today, and I was thinking about some of the questions I was going to ask, I realised that although all fond of you, I think, dabbled in digital art, none of you are primarily digital artists. How do you think? Okay, who's nodding the most before asking this? I think it was you, Anke. How do you think digital art is changing that landscape of Tolkien art?
I'm not quite sure it does, because for many, I know quite a lot of artists who work almost exclusively in a digital medium, and for them it's just another tool. It's like they don't care whether they draw with a pencil. For some it's just a question of cost. They can't afford the art materials. They bought maybe a tablet once, and now they produce digital art because it's mostly for online consumption, and for them it's just cost effective. And that's something I tell my students when they come to me. Well, I can just use an iPad, or I can just use a computer. And yeah, but you still need to practice drawing. The computer won't do it itself. You still have to. You have to practice. You have to know a few things, maybe about perspective, about lighting, and proportion. If you want to draw in a naturalistic manner. So I think the basic skills are the same, and the basic ideas, and it's just another medium. And maybe it's what may change things a bit is that it's easier to put stuff out there on social media because you don't need expensive art materials. You don't need a studio for if you want to make something that looks, for example, like an oil painting, even though a digital painting that looks like an oil painting is not the same as a real thing, obviously. But it's I think it changes the way art is being consumed and talked about, and maybe you get a wider audience that way. But the actual drawing is similar, I think.
Because you're quite active on social media generally, aren't you, Jenny?
Yeah.
Would you agree with that the digital art itself isn't necessarily changing how we're portraying Tolkien, but is helping artists to connect?
I wouldn't say the medium influences that so much. So when I think of who is doing Tolkien art and what sorts of artists there are in that really produce wonderful work and that consistently come back to Tolkien, I can't really think of many people who work exclusively with digital media. I think the majority there is still traditional, probably more so than with other forms of expression and with other fandoms, as it were. So I think that Tolkien really brings out the traditional artists.
Is there a reason for that? Why isn't that his?
I think it is it feels a bit hands-on and maybe old-fashioned in the good way. So I know that I never did any digital Tolkien art. I did a lot of digital art back in the day, but for Tolkien I always returned to pencil and watercolor because it felt right.
From my perspective, digital art has no soul. What I mean by that, it has no legacy. When you produce anything digitally, it disappears, and we get 10 other million other images that appear on the net. The thing that we produce is art. We put our heart and our souls, and we have years of training. These guys that become great artists overnight, they spend a lifetime building their skill set. Then they took their passion and their love, and they took their soul, and they put on a bit of paper. That's what art is. Digital art isn't art. It has no soul.
I don't quite see it that way.
You disagree? I like it.
If we're all practicing digital artists, we probably won't be able to distinguish any of us from each other, whereas we're all working in traditional mediums and it's immediately recognisable who has done what. Digital art has a way of kind of making everything sort of, just kind of on the same sort of level.
When you were in New Zealand, you did do some digital art.
I did, but that was mainly because I was then at a period where we were using photographic material. Lots of shots had been taken to kind of design the post-production process and the digital works that needs to be created. So working with landscape photography and with shots with green screens, it just made sense to kind of use that material to do the artwork. Just to take it kind of further down the track. But I find it interesting and satisfying in some way, but I didn't feel it was a particularly kind of artistic
Yeah, I think what is lacking in digital art is a certain degree of randomness. I mean, three of us work in watercolor where often color and paper and pigment do things you can't control or can only control in a certain way, and that's the beautiful thing about watercolor. And also there's the thing about risk-taking. You do something and you can't just click back or go back to a version of your picture you've saved. I mean, you can, of course, correct things later on once it's scanned in Photoshop, but the original, any mistakes you make or if you change your mind about something, it will be there, especially with watercolor. I mean, with oil and acrylics, you can maybe figure out a bit more, but yeah. And with digital art, you can back all the time and correct things if you want.
So you're saying you can make it perfect?
Yeah, in a way, yes. And there are, a traditional picture is imperfect in a good way, and that makes it original and unique.
Can I say something to that?
No.
What just struck me when you were talking was that I think the possibility to always go back makes you want to do a digital picture feel much more polished, at least with than watercolor. I remember really spending 3 times as much time on a digital painting than I ever did on a traditional one, because with the traditional one you can overwork it. With a digital one you also can, but you don't know. So you just keep going back, and I still can perfect that nostril a bit more, and it ends up looking like plastic and very much, at least with me, and it's a feeling I get with a lot of digital art I see. So there is the tendency to just polish it up so much that it becomes rigid and not very much alive, and especially for those of us who work in watercolor. But also with the vividness I see in your works, there is this direct expression, and of course for somebody viewing the artwork, something that you would never have with the digital one, that you can actually stand in front of it and imagine the artist actually touched that spot and drew his brush over there and left his mark in the very real sense of the word.
I think there's an interesting point between, I'm not trying to disparage the talent or the skill set that's necessary to produce digital art. Believe it or not, I am a digital artist. My creative process involves creating digital images, and I've created sketches and all sorts through my job. So I don't disparage the skill set. What I'm trying to say is, and I suppose the best way I can round it up is the best line I've ever heard about art is if you're going to buy a piece of art, buy a bit of the artist's soul. And to me, that's what art is about. And it's the difference between being an illustrator. So for my job, I illustrate, but for my life, I paint. I'm a painter. And I think there is a slight difference between the two.
Indeed.
Do you think Tolkien would agree?
I think Tolkien was a painter. Because he wasn't. I imagine when he did it, I thought he didn't think for a minute anybody would ever see them. Because they're pretty crap, really. But they are. They weren't. I don't think he did it. I think they just happened.
You're being very rude about Alan's favourite artist.
Criticizing.
Alan's just upset this Pauline's mind and not him. That's a reason.
And I did think of a couple of examples, by the way. It takes me a while to get there.
Oh yes.
Lothlorien. Problem is that it's described as perfect, timeless, and that unfortunately is rather boring for art, because what is so beautiful is a painting of a ruin or something where there's tangles of roots and things of this kind, and it's a bit messy, and then there's a moment where there's this transcendent bit of light somewhere, and the mood is captured, and there's a sense that there's motion. All of that is you're really challenged about with Lothlorien. So I tried to bear in mind what he has described, but at the same time realizing it's kind of impossible But I do know that at that time when he wrote that, it was very important to him to try to express something where it was almost impossible. The timelessness of elves and their longevity and everything was also infused in the realm, and it was what made it distinct and important for the scheme of the story. And I think as a story device, it's fantastic. Not so great for the artist. Some things are described one way, and it's in, it's an ethereal, ephemeral sort of description of something. It's very difficult to paint it, though. And maybe it's better to, just let go of those things and not try to see if you can overcome the challenge, which, but I think it's fun to see if you can. Another one is, it's interesting how this isn't really a criticism, but this is where Tolkien lets us get away with being completely inconsistent with his text and his descriptions, because he himself, the picture of Bilbo comes to the huts of the draft elves, absolutely not in the book. That scene, because when we read it, he's invisible, we don't see him, and he arrives at night, such that he lands his barrel on the shore and creeps around the huts, steals a pie, until the sun comes up. He sort of, wanders around, perhaps invisibly with his ring. So all of that is rather not helpful to an artist. I love that. That should be this pie floating off. The Witch King's head, which is not there, and then the sort of eyes somehow. These are all rather difficult things to kind of portray, but we're all used to it now.
So, before I'm going to go to the audience, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of good questions, what is your favourite aspect, favourite thing, scene, character in Tolkien's works that you like to paint? We'll go for Ted first.
I would go back to Luthien and Beren any number of times, probably. I think that the idea of expressing her beauty, that's another thing that's where you have perfection, absolutely impossible perfection. At the same time, I know that there are mathematics around beauty, and that it's possible to give an approximation that is good enough for the viewer. And I love the idea of kind of exploring her as a person rather than some incredibly impossible perfection, an icon. And I think, of course, it's argued that he sort of saw the Virgin Mary in some ways. Her clothing is similar and so on. So that for him it was a very, very important concept. But and Rivendell and some of these other sort of iconic places in Minas Tirith. And I do go back to them pretty regularly, and I usually do because I feel I have something new to express.
Jay?
Agreed, Luthien and Beren. Tried in oils, acrylics, and so many different mediums that you could explore that, and I'm trying to get into the emotional connection between the two characters, which I really enjoyed doing. But yeah, Luthien and Beren.
Yanni?
I think I won't get away with saying I have no favourite character. I keep coming back to the tragic characters in the Silmarillion, mainly the Fëanorians, mainly Maelgros, because he just encapsulates all this tragedy and all this failing. I've always been drawn to really sad stories and stories that end in utter ruin. So the Silmarillion was right up my alley.
Okay, Anke?
I think my favourite character is no secret either. So, that's Faramir, but I also have a very soft spot for the hobbits and the Shire, because I like the description of the landscape, and it feels very familiar to me, even though I'm not from the UK. Where I live is basically the Shire, so it's like coming home, really, as it is.
Alan?
Well, I think it's the landscapes, not the landscapes, probably the forests more than anything, and of the forest, maybe Fandom. I'm really interested in cities and architecture, so I guess -2. But if I could have 2, it would be -2 and Fandom.
Okay. Right, should we go to some questions from the audience? Maggie, right at the very back, was the very first. Do we have any mics for the audience? I don't know if we do.
This speaks to the other here.
Oh, yeah.
Really find it back.
Project.
Anyone hear that? I'm interested by what you said, Ted, about Florian being very difficult because of life. And one of the things that does frustrate me a little, and it frustrated me a lot in the films, was that Florian was only ever shown at night or in the dark. And quite frankly, Florian, to me, the magic of Florian is the quality of light that's there during the day. And I appreciate that capturing that light is difficult. But have any of you ever been to the thought, shall I give that a try?
What was that last line?
The quality of light
Yeah.
of Love Florian.
I agree, yes, there's a lot one can do that just evoke something extraordinary and consistent with what he describes there. And you just take the risk that, okay, it's not going to be like some old master's painting where it's the traditional sort of asymmetrical distribution of light, shadow, moodiness, and so on. It's a different kind of thing, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Hi. I have a friend who's an artist. I was curious, because of something that happened recently, if you had any ridiculous stories of people criticizing your work that you wanted to share.
When I very first, I spent about 10 years painting before I actually showed anybody. And I sent 2 paintings to a guy called René van Rossenberg. He's not Johnstone, he's a nice guy. And I sent 2 pictures to a guy called Mark Faith. And both of them went, oh, they're fantastic, actually great, can you send us some more? So I sent them another half a dozen. And René van Rossenberg didn't get back to me, but Mark Faith did, and he said, what are they? But you're a Tolkien fan, you're a big Tolkien guy. He sells his paintings, and he says, yes, so what are these paintings about then? And he didn't make the connection between the medieval and the Christian and the Tolkien connection. He says, well, there's nothing I can do for you because I don't get it. And my instant, and I thought to myself, well, obviously I've wasted the last 10 years because they're rubbish. They're actually not very good. And then I sent them to René van Rossenberg, and René van Rossenberg put me in touch with the Tolkien Society. And I met Shaun. Shaun said he must come along. And they called Becky Dillon. And there was a great set of people who encouraged me, who got what I did. But had I only sent them to Mark, my art career would have never started.
By the way, his is over.
Is it?
Yes. Retired, safely out.
So criticism, particularly when artists are starting out, can be quite, people take it personally because you actually think, well, am I any good or am I wasting my time? And now I am 10 years later, and I'm quite successful now, and I'm doing okay, and I'm so pleased with the Tolkien Society for helping me, assisting me, and just appealing to them, and just being there for me.
Thank you for that, Shane. We'll go to John next.
This one? Yes. So each of you has your own signature style to an extent. I know there's a spectrum for each of you too. But Tolkien writes in many voices, especially in Lord of the Rings, where there are different registers for battle scenes and Shire scenes, Rivendell's Bilbo's song in Rivendell, and so on and so forth. Do you ever feel the need to, or see a way to vary your style to match those different registers? Is it a challenge that you feel?
Do you want to take that straightforward question?
I think I always love having the opportunity to illustrate poetry. So there are a couple of occasions where I've taken a line from one of the songs, one of the poems, as a starting point for the illustrations. And that gives you a certain amount of more license. You know, you're not recreating a moment in the story, you're creating a sort of a mood that's being evoked by the poem. So, for example, an image I did of Luthien dancing, then it was based on Aragorn's remembrance of that story. Just allowed a more kind of free-flowing and slightly more kind of abstract approach to the image.
Okay. Right, let's see what Brian says next.
I want to take it back to Tolkien, if I may. We know what Jenny's feelings about Tolkien's art is. But what I wanted to ask is that there are certain books that get illustrated over and over again. And those books are usually books that are hugely compelling in some way or other. But many of them have taken a long while to throw off the shackles of the original illustrator. I think of, for example, Alice in Wonderland, which is now profusely illustrated by thousands of people, but originally was very much locked down by Tenniel's original images. Or you could say Wind in the Willows and Ernest Shepard's pictures, for example. But what it strikes me about what Tolkien did is partly because his choice was often to show place, not people, and that he was very selective about what he illustrated, that I wonder whether you feel, you and the other many artists, because you're representative of a huge body of people who've challenged our imaginations with your view of Tolkien's imagination. I wonder whether you feel that freedom exists because Tolkien didn't actually tie everything down in that, or another illustrator indeed, you know, that Tolkien and an artist of that first edition didn't lock everything down for you.
I would absolutely agree with that, yes. So there is nothing iconic in the earlier versions. Something that has come up before and that most of us are now facing is, at least with people who are not as knowledgeable, sorry, my speech apparatus has frozen because it's so cold here. So people who are not as knowledgeable as those who are here, for example, often tell us, why does your Faramir look so weird? Why is your Faramir dark-haired? Why is your Legolas not blonde? These things. So I think the movies have done a lot to manifest the characters, basically, and also the landscapes in the general consciousness. But if you consciously choose to do something else, everybody will, one, say that you're free to do so, and two, applaud you for using your own imagination. So I would very much agree with what you said.
Okay, I think we've got the last question over there.
Yes, hello. Thank you all for all the wonderful work you do.
You're very welcome.
This question, of course, is for Ted. My question is, what of all your Tolkien pieces is your favorite and why?
I got that question in the class, actually, and there really isn't an answer to that. It could be one of the ones out of the Silmarillion that stands out, maybe the Kinslaying, for instance, which I felt was particularly successful because Christopher himself encouraged me to do it. And then it could be one of the ones from the Lord of the Rings, whether published or unpublished, and that I feel I particularly nailed it, and it feels really right for me, and I wouldn't need to ever go back to that. It's kind of like I've done that one. I like the Fangorn Forest when I did. So I said, well, I could narrow it down to maybe 10 or so that for me are outstanding, and that I feel like, yeah, I actually really feel comfortable with how that came out, and it just felt right, and everything sort of gelled perfectly, so, all good. The perfectionist in me is satisfied and doesn't bother me that voice is going. And other, parts of the book that The Hobbit, I've got 3 or 4 that I might have loved to do, that I felt that I really had, worked well. think, Bilbo above the forest of Mirkwood, was a rather nice little capsulization of him. There's a lot of them. Yeah. After this long, it's like, there must be 200, 300 full color pieces, So it's a tough one.
Okay, well, thank you for that answer. Thank you to Jay, Ted, Jenny, Anke, and Alan for joining us.